So welcome to everyone. We are going to look at the very beginning, initially, of Parshas VaYeshev. The Parsha follows the career of Yaakov and especially Yosef and his adventures, misadventures, and that of his brethren as well. And what I'd like to look at initially is the opening pasuk. If you've got the Art Scroll Chumash, it's on page 189. But any Chumash that you may have, you can find the beginning of Parshas VaYeshev, which is starting with chapter 37. VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz mugurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. So this is an introductory pasuk which orients the story, which is not really necessary because we know that Yaakov is in the land of Canaan because he returned in last week's Parsha, and we have immediately prior to this a lengthy, somewhat tedious account of the descendants of Esav, and now we have the pasuk that sort of refocuses our attention on Yaakov and his family. But still, Alshikh asks, why does the Torah say, VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz mugurei aviv? We know that his father lived in Canaan, and it repeats the word be'eretz Canaan. It says the word be'eretz twice. VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz mugurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. It could have simply said, VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz Canaan. It would have been sufficient. Or it could have said Be'eretz Mugurei Aviv Shuhu Canaan, or Be'eretz Canaan Mugurei Aviv. It doesn't have to repeat the word Be'eretz twice. And then it continues, Ela told us Yaakov, Yosef, etc. The generations of Yaakov, or here it's rendered the chronicles of Jacob, Joseph at the age of 17, etc. So Rashi is also alert to this, and Rashi says that after the Torah described briefly the descendants of Esav, the Torah now returns to focus in much more elaborate fashion on the happenings of Yaakov. However, the Alshikh asks some further questions as well. So there's a well-known tradition, Rashi mentions it, that the desire of Yaakov was to live in peace. Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Said, I think it's in Rashi. I believe it is, yeah. Or maybe not, I think it is. Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Yaakov wanted to dwell in peace, in serenity, tranquility. And this is true, but it didn't happen. He was, so to speak, overtaken. Events overtook him, the anger of Yosef. It means the family turmoil that was stirred up through Yosef. It was partly Yosef's fault, partly Yaakov's fault for favoring Yosef. Certainly the brothers also share a measure of responsibility, but Yaakov's shalva, Yaakov's tranquility did not endure, as we know because we're familiar with the Parsha, having read it year after year. So this is the intro, and Rashi kind of highlights the irony. That's why it says Yaakov bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. So according to that, there's a deliberate irony. VaYeshev Yaakov sought to dwell. Again, the word leishev implies a sort of harmonious, peaceful maintenance of stability in the land of Mugurei Aviv, where his father was only a sojourner. And this highlights the contrast and helps to explain why it says Be'eretz Mugurei Aviv. But still, there has to be more to it. Moshe Alshikh asks a question which I hope is on your mind. What is so wrong with Yaakov wanting to dwell in peace? He was not proposing to use the peace for personal aggrandizement. He would use the peace for greater mitzvah observance, for the study of Torah. Maybe he would take up some of the good work of his grandfather Abraham with the kiruv, outreach. He would focus on raising his children and his grandchildren. There's nothing inherently objectionable about living in peace. Why did the sages criticize Yaakov, and the sages even say that is it not enough for the righteous to enjoy the reward in the next world? They want to have reward in this world as well. I mean, is that so bad? Don't we say every morning, these are the things that a person eats the fruits in this world, and the the principle is preserved for the next world, but he still enjoys the fruits of his labor, of his efforts in this world. So why does the Torah and the sages somehow cast Yaakov into a negative light because he sought to dwell in peace and it was not to be? Then he asked another question, which he asked this kind of a question often, and I like it because it's the sort of observation which can easily escape the reader, but it really should not, because it's quite an evident question or sort of curiosity that we need to consider, and that is the sequence, the juxtaposition, the appearance of this verse, which does not really appear to be closely connected to that which follows, nor to that which preceded. When the Torah says, Eila told us Yaakov, Yosef, these are the happenings, the chronicles of Yaakov, it all surrounds Yosef, that we can understand, that's fine. But how does that follow from the first verse? VaYeshev Yaakov eretz Miguraviv eretz Canaan. Then just goes on, Eila told us. We don't really need that first pasuk at all, superficially. Moreover, it doesn't seem to be connected to that which came before it. When we turn the page back, or cast your mind back to last week's Torah reading, where I already mentioned that the end of last week's Parasha, actually, it's quite an extended, it's not a narrative, an extended list of all the various descendants of Esav and what he did, who he married and who his children married, and a little bit of passing reference to some of the things they got up to, but it's mostly just a long list of names. It's not very exciting. And again, we don't see how VaYeshev Yaakov necessarily follows from what preceded it. And we would expect any verse in the Torah, or lahavdil, any other book, to be related to that which came before it or that which comes after it. Even if it's the end of a paragraph or the end of a chapter, it should relate to what preceded it. If it's the beginning of a chapter, we would certainly expect it to relate to that which follows it. But this one doesn't seem to be connected to that which preceded it or that followed it. Okay, this is my introduction, conveying how Alshikh approaches this passage. He says the following. The key, he says, is that Yitzchak was a sojourner in the land of Canaan, even though he was born in Canaan, and he never left Canaan. He lived there his whole life. And he was quite respected at certain times. Maybe he was driven away by the Plishtim, by the Philistines also. But nevertheless, we find that he lived his whole life in the land of Canaan. However, Yitzchak was born after the covenant between the parts, the Bris Ben Mitzrayim, in which we have the fateful words that Hashem told Abraham, Yadoa Teida ki ger yezarecha be'eretz lo lahem. You shall surely know that your progeny will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Va'avdum ve'inu osam. They will oppress them. They will enslave them 400 years. It's interesting. The pasuk begins ki ger yihyeh zarecha in the singular. Be'eretz lo lahem in the plural. Va'avdum ve'inu osam 400 shana describes the Jewish people, the progeny of Abraham, in the plural. Goes from the singular to the plural. Says the Alshikh, and many of them before I should make this observation as well. Rashi also refers to it elsewhere, that the 400 years begins with the birth of Yitzchak. And Yitzchak, when he wanted to leave, he was told Shchon ba'aretz hazos. Then he was told Gur ba'aretz hazeh. Gur means to dwell, but it comes to the word ger. In other words, Yitzchak's status was always that of a sojourner in the land of Canaan. He did not achieve the comfort and the security and the status of one who possesses the land, but he was traveling from place to place, in some cases driven from place to place. Yitzchak was the beginning of the 400 years of exile began with Yitzchak. That's why it's here, Eretz Megurei Aviv. Yitzchak was a ger. Yaakov wants to settle. What's so bad about Yaakov wanting to settle? It's not just that Yaakov wants more comfort and more stability than his father enjoyed. It's not that. It's much more. The 400 years began with Yitzchak, but if Yaakov is going to dwell in security and in serenity and in tranquility and in prosperity, VaYeshev Yaakov, then it sets back the clock. The years of exile that already began to be clocked up with the birth of Yitzchak. And remember, Yitzchak lived to the age of 180. Without doing the math scrupulously here, we know about Yitzchak's death already at the end of last week's Parasha. Actually, that's not quite true. His death is mentioned at the end of last week's Parasha. According to the chronology, actually, Yitzchak was still alive at the time of the sale of Yosef. But even so, let's say, and again, maybe we can calculate, I think we can, but let's just say 160 years or something like that of the life of Yitzchak had elapsed, and that counts towards the 400 years of exile. If Yaakov had wanted to dwell or had achieved his objective of dwelling in comfort, then it would have set back the clock to zero, and the years of exile would have begun with the descendants of Yaakov, with the progeny of Yaakov. That's why it says, Rugzol shel Yosef, the agitation of Yosef, created a circumstance in which Yaakov did not achieve his desire of kicking back and being able to live in peace, but rather the agitation and the trouble surrounding the events of Yosef and the jealousy and the enmity and the sale into slavery, and Yaakov thought that Yosef was dead. That experience for Yaakov definitely shattered the Bikesh Leishev Bashalva, and as a result, there was no yishuv, there was no stability in the life of Yaakov, but rather he continued the clock of the exile of Yitzchak continued in the life of Yaakov and in the life of his children, certainly in the life of Yosef, who really was in exile in Egypt, although as we know, he rose to prominence after many vicissitudes along the way as well. So this is how Alshikh explains this pasuk. He says it's connected to that which follows. Eila toldos Yaakov, Yosef, through Yosef, the stability, the serenity of Yaakov was fractured, was disrupted, and therefore Yaakov did not achieve what he had hoped of Leishev Beshalva, but rather he was his life was a continuation of the turmoil and the exile that began with Yitzchak. Then Alshikh takes a further different look at this, and actually tonight we're going to see three different approaches, one in a way building on the other, although they're distinct from one another as well. He suggests another derech as well. He says that this verse, VaYeshev Yaakov Be'eretz Megorer Aviv, can be seen as connected to that which precedes it. Now, we mentioned already a couple of times tonight, we've only been talking for 12 minutes, that Yaakov, his life and his events are described in quite a lot of detail, but it comes immediately after the brief record, the brief reckoning of the descendants of Esau. So it says in particular, if you look in chapter 36, verse 6, which takes us to near the beginning of the previous chapter, if you got the article, it's on page 192, chapter 36, verse 6. Vayikach Esav es nashav es banav es benosav. Esav took his wives, his sons, his daughters, as kol nafshos beiso, all of the members of his household, his entourage and his household staff, etc. Ves miknehu, and their cattle, their livestock, as behemtov, as kol kinyano, all of their possessions, asher achash beretz Canaan, whatever wealth he had acquired, he had amassed in Canaan. Vayelech el eretz mipnei Yaakov achiv, and he said, I'm out of here, and he left the land of Canaan. It goes on to say because they were too wealthy to stay there together, but Esau didn't contest the land of Canaan. He cleared out and he found himself Seir, and that's where he settled, and that's where he perhaps prospered, and that's where his descendants lived, and they were prominent people, and that's where that was the land that they colonized. Says the Alshikh that Esav left Canaan for the following reason. Esav was well aware that the land of Canaan had been promised to his grandfather Avraham, had been transmitted to his father Yitzchak, and that Yitzchak had transmitted it, and the progeny of Yitzchak, who are two, Esav and Yaakov, were in a position to claim that patrimony, that inheritance of the land of Canaan. Now, it's true that Yitzchak probably gave it to Yaakov, but Esav did not want to contest it. Why not? Because of that prophecy that we mentioned before, which surely was well known, that Hashem said to Avraham that your descendants will ultimately inherit this land, but there's a price to be paid along the way. There is servitude, there is persecution. Va'avdum ve'inu osam. Esav said to himself, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to pay the promissory note, the debt that needs to be settled in order to claim this land. So you know what? I'm out of here. That's why he left. So when it says, looking again at our pasuk that we've been analyzing closely, VaYeshev Yaakov be'eretz megorei aviv, and then it says again be'eretz Canaan. He says the second eretz, when it says be'eretz Canaan, the base be'eretz Canaan can be understood as ba'avur, that Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojourn, knowing that the worst was still to come in terms of the price to be paid before they can claim this land, be'eretz Canaan, ba'avur eretz Canaan, for the purpose of claiming and ultimately inheriting the land of Canaan. That's why he settled there, even though it was be'eretz megorei aviv. So according to this approach, he says that Yaakov knowingly continued, he's knowingly extended the Eretz Megurei Aviv, the place of his father's sojourn, recognizing that it's only through paying the price of the 400 years of servitude that he and his descendants would merit the realization of the promise to Abraham. Esav wasn't interested in that. That's why Esav cleared out. And that's why this pasuk, according to this pasuk is related to what precedes it. So in contrast to Esav, who developed his dynasty and his descendants, and they made a land for themselves and a country for themselves in Seir, wherever that is exactly. In contrast, Yaakov stayed in Canaan. He was prepared to pay the price ultimately of the exile, the Egyptian exile, in order to realize the blessing that had been given to him and his destiny and his family's destiny of ultimately inheriting the land of Canaan, which Esav did not want to do. Then there's a third approach. And the third approach of Alshikh is of a different perspective, which I find quite relevant in the world around me. Please God, not so much in my own personal circumstances. And I hope I've piqued your curiosity. What's it all about? So he says, according to this third approach, it's connected to what precedes it and what follows it. He says like this: the Torah describes in the previous passage, the extended passage going on for however many, 40 psukim, more than 43 verses in all of chapter 36. The Torah describes Esav, who is powerful, who founds a dynasty of generals or chieftains or warlords, whatever designation we may give them. And the Torah describes them without going into, not elaborating on their character, but it gives us a long list. I used the word tedious before as well. It doesn't excite us very much. Says Alshikh, you know what? The Torah here is teaching us about the grief of family feuds, family disputes. The Torah tells us about the lives of all of these descendants of Esav, who, whether individually or collectively, in sort of the nature of Esav, is that he hates Yaakov. He's the antagonist of Yaakov. So, says Alshikh, the Torah says that all of these people, all the descendants of Esav, who are antagonists of Yaakov, who would like to do him in if the opportunity presented itself. Even though it's true that when they met in last week's Parasha, Esav was perhaps temporarily, amenable to Yaakov, but ultimately Esav sonei Yaakov. And despite all that, and the Canaanim were also not the most friendly people. We find later on in Jewish history plenty of conflict with the Canaanim. So certainly in terms of the symbolism, what Esav represents, what the Canaanim represent, they're all completely antagonistic to what Yaakov stands for. Nevertheless, look at the pasuk in our pasuk. VaYeshev Yaakov beretz mugorei aviv. He's sitting pretty. He's very comfortable. He is living peacefully. Doesn't last, but he's living peacefully. Beretz mugorei aviv, beretz Canaan. Even though he's in the land of Canaan, where the Canaanim are not favorably disposed to what Yaakov represents. The Canaanim are degenerate. The Canaanim are pagans, but nevertheless, Yaakov, so far, at least for the first half of the verse, VaYeshev Yaakov beretz mugorei aviv, until the trouble begins. Where do Yaakov's troubles come from? Not from Esav and not from Canaan. They come from his own family, from his own household. It says the Alshikh that here we see tsaras beiso hakashemi kol tsar hatzorer mibachutz, that family troubles are more egregious, are more painful, are more disruptive, are more of a threat to a person's equanimity than all of these external forces. We recently had occasion, I say we, I don't know if we discussed it in the shir, perhaps we did, I don't recall, but the whole country and the whole world reflected on the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II and her reign and all of that. As far as I'm aware, and I'm no expert in the history of the royal family, even in the current times, but as far as I'm aware, there was no threat to her personal well-being once she became queen. I mean, she was a young person during World War II. She became queen shortly thereafter. And it was years of pretty much of peace. The 70 years have been pretty peaceful. Okay, a skirmish in Falkland Islands, didn't personally threaten the Queen's well-being. But the family troubles, which are very well documented and are still rumbling on, must have caused her a lot of agmas nefesh. And that's true, as I say, for, we can, I'm sure, relate to this. Hopefully no one in his own family that are listening to this shiur, but we have seen, we've observed people whose lives are blighted by family troubles, family struggles, and that sort of thing. So this is the point that Alshikh makes, that it's connected to that which precedes and that which follows. That which precedes is from all of the menacing descendants of Esav. They didn't do Yaakov any harm. Neither did the people of Canaan. The harm to Yaakov came from within his own family. Eila told us Yaakov, Yosef was 17 years old. Again, we said Yaakov perhaps bears some of the responsibility, and there's enough responsibility to go around, which is usually the case in family troubles, that there is culpability on both sides. Okay, I don't want to moralize, but I think it's a very beautiful and relevant insight from Alshikh on this pasuk. In the minutes we have left, I want to take up a completely different aspect of our parsha. And this is the very fascinating and in some ways perplexing story of Yehuda and Tamar. So turn with me to Perek Lamed Ches, chapter 38, which you can find if you're with the art scroll on page 208. Vahi be'esahi vayered Yehuda me'es echav. That at this time, Yehuda went down from his brothers. So Alshikh, the time is short, so I'll be brief here. Alshikh asks a number of questions. He says, why does it begin Vahi be'esahi? Why not just say, get on with it? Vayered Yehuda me'es echav. Yehuda went down from his brethren, etc. Why begin Vahi be'esahi at that time? What's the significance of be'esahi at that time? What's so significant? Whatever is described happened at the time that was described. What information is further conveyed by the words ba'esahi at that time? Again, vayihi, also, it doesn't say vayihi every time, and it was at that time. So we need an explanation for that. Also, he quotes from Chazal a very harsh criticism of Yehuda. There is a verse in Malachi which says, Bagde Yehuda, Yehuda has betrayed, Uva'al bas el nechar, and he has consorted with the daughter of a foreign god. So the rabbis apply that verse, which Malachi, the prophet Malachi, said about the people of Yehuda, meaning the Jewish people collectively. But the sages apply that pasuk to Yehuda himself. And they say that this is what Yehuda did. He acted in a treacherous, in a unworthy manner, and he consorted. He took as a wife the daughter of a foreign god. So who is this daughter of a foreign god? The interesting thing is the Torah doesn't give us her name. The Torah tells us her father, Bas Shua. Now, I thought at one time maybe Bas Shua is a name like Bas Sheva, but it seems not, at least not how Alshikh understands it. Shua was her father. Her father was called Shua. She was called Bas Shua. Does she have a first name? I'm sure she did. I must have called her something, but the Torah does not tell us her name. It's interesting about Tamar, it's the opposite. The Torah doesn't tell us who her father was, doesn't tell us about her origins at all. It just says there was a woman called Tamar. He says later on, Tamar, Tzadik Tamar Yifrach, Tamar was righteous. And that's why Tamar is known by her name as a person for who she was. This woman that Yehuda ended up with initially, she's just called Bas Shua, and it was wrong for him to take her because she wasn't up to much, and she was a Canaanite woman, which is not a good way to begin. And he says that Yehuda was demoted by his brothers because he was criticized, although he did well to save Joseph from death, but he should have done better, and he should have used his leadership position to instruct or encourage or urge the brothers to completely abandon their plot against Joseph, not simply to sell him into slavery and save him from death in that way, but to go further and to send him home to his father. And because he didn't, the brothers felt guilty for what they did, but they also felt that Yehuda should have shown better leadership. Someone who does half a job when he could have done the job fully is criticized. Botzea barech na'etz Hashem, the pasuk says. So therefore, Yehuda was kind of demoted. The brothers said, you let us down, boss. You're the top of the pyramid here, and you let us down, because they saw how upset their father was, how not just upset, but how devastated their father was. So therefore, Yehuda was kind of, I wouldn't say driven away, but he was demoted, and he went off on his own. And because of that, he managed to find his way to marry this Bas Shua. And because of that, the children who were born to him, Er v'Onan, were not really worthy. And Er v'Onan did not live long. If you work out the chronology, they did not live even to the age of Bar Mitzvah. It seems in those days people must have matured more quickly, because one of them married Tamar and then he died, and the other one married Tamar as a Yibum situation, and he also died, Er v'Onan. And he asks, Alshikh asks, why did God punish them so quickly? Without going into unnecessary detail, although it would help to shed light on our subject, I don't want to dwell on it. They died, they didn't have a second chance even. And now Tamar is twice widowed, and she is desirous of still being part of the family of Yehuda. But she doesn't want to wait for Shelah, because she realizes the following, and this is the Chiddush, the fascinating insight or suggestion which is advanced by Alshikh, from Moshe Alshikh, ha-Kadosh. And he says that this Bas Shua was not worthy of bearing children to Yehuda who would fulfill the destiny of the progeny of Yehuda, which would be to the kings of Israel. As we know, Peretz is going to be the ancestor of David HaMelech, the Davidic line, Mashiach, Tzidkenu, all of that will come from Yehuda. But Bas Shua is not the one to deliver that achievement. So therefore, Er and Onan, they were not up to it because of their origins. Tamar desired to be the one who would be the partner of Yehuda to bring forth into the world the Zera HaMelucha, But Shelah couldn't do it. Why not? Because if she had married Shelah, who was the third son, and naturally she would have done Yibum with him, then Shelah would have brought into the world, I hope I'm not confusing you, the soul of Onan, because the mitzvah of Yibum is to provide a means by which the deceased brother can come back into the world. The soul comes down into the world through the medium of the wife of the deceased and the brother of the deceased. But Shelah would only bring into the world the soul of Onan. But Onan was not the Bechor. It was the Bechor who was heir, who could have been and should have been able to be the progenitor of Mashiach, but he was not up to it because he derived from an impure source. Says the Alshikh that the line of the Davidic dynasty and through King David Mashiach came about through Yibum. But it wasn't even a normal Yibum, it was a Yibum with the father, because Yehuda was the one who was able to bring back into the world the souls of Er and Onan. He says that Peretz, who is the son of Tamar, and Zerach, who is the son of Tamar, they were twins, are the souls of Er and Onan. Peretz is really Er. The soul of Er came back into the world through Peretz. But Peretz was born through Yehuda and Tamar, who were both righteous. And therefore, David HaMelech came from that union. And what about David HaMelech? Because he came about through Yibum, so his stability in this world was weak. His stability was lacking in a kind of a total robust position. This is why David HaMelech was destined to have been a Nefel. You probably know the well-known tradition that King David was destined to have been stillborn. He was only granted 70 years of life from Adam HaRishon. And that's because he came about through Yibum. So what we see is that Yehuda and Tamar, the union of Yehuda and Tamar was necessary to bring down the soul of David HaMelech into this world. But it came about through Peretz, and Peretz in turn was the reincarnation, the Gilgul of the firstborn of Yehuda, who is Er. So he also explains how Er is like Ra, which is backwards, but it didn't quite work out because Asa Ra B'nei Hashem. But ultimately, this is why it says VaYehi, because of the Vai, the woe. VaYehi means that at that time, and it was specifically at that time because Yehuda was in a state of distress. He felt as if he had let the side down in failing to completely rescue Yosef, and therefore he distanced himself from his brothers, and he found himself in this marriage with the Bas Shua, which did not work well. She did not live either. And ultimately, this is why this parsha begins, Vayhi Be'esahi. It actually speaks at great length, but we don't have time for more. And this is the essence of it. So just to summarize what we've said now with Yehuda and Tamar, that Peretz and Zerach, who were born through Yehuda and Tamar, were the reincarnation of Er and Onan. And because Yehuda's first wife Bathshua was not really worthy, it was to Tamar, who was virtuous, ultimately, that these children were born, these sons were born, and it was Peretz who would become the progenitor of David HaMelech. Then just to summarize and to review as we like to do, the first part we said about VaYeshev, Yaakov, Eretz V'Gorav, we said three things. We said that he wanted to live in peace, and it wasn't destined to be. The reason that he's criticized for wanting to live in peace is by so doing, he would have canceled out all of the years of the life of Yitzchak, which began the sojourn, began the period of exile. And that's why his troubles that came about through the form of Yosef actually accomplished the goal of moving forward, the realization of the prophecy of the 400 years of exile. We said another approach is that Esav left the land of Canaan because he didn't want to pay the price of the exile, and it was Yaakov who stayed in the land of Canaan because he wanted to realize the prophecy to inherit the land, and he was prepared to endure the consequences, to endure the price tag, so to speak, of the years of exile. And then the last thing we mentioned for the first opening pasuk is the observation about how the menacing descendants of Esav did not cause Yaakov harm. The Canaanites did not cause Yaakov harm. Unfortunately, the turmoil in his life came about through his own household, through Yosef and his brothers, etc. And this is the inside of Alshikh. Thank you for listening. And as I said, a lot to speak about, as always, today. And thank you for tuning in. I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbos.